ஐபிசி தமிழ் நேயர்களுக்கு வணக்கம். இது ஒரு விசேட நிகழ்ச்சியாக அமைய இருக்கின்றது. முக்கியமாக இன்றைய எமது விருந்தினர்கள் ஆங்கிலத்திலே உரையாட இருப்பதனால் இந்த நிகழ்ச்சி முற்றுமுழுதாக ஆங்கிலத்திலே வர இருக்கின்றது. பார்வையாளர்கள் பொறுத்துக்கொள்ள வேண்டும். இது ஒரு முக்கியமான ஒரு நிகழ்ச்சியாக இருப்பதனால் இந்த நேர்காணலை முக்கியமாக செய்கின்றோம். முக்கியமாக ஐடிஜேபி இன்டர்நேஷனல் ட்ரூத் அண்ட் ஜஸ்டிஸ் ப்ரொஜெக்டினால் அண்மையிலே வெளியிடப்பட்ட ஒரு அந்த அறிக்கையில் வேலை செய்தவர்கள், அதில் எக்ஸ்பர்ட்டாக இருப்பவர்களை இன்று நாங்கள் நேர்காணல் செய்ய இருக்கின்றோம். அதனால் இந்த நிகழ்ச்சி முற்றுமுழுதாக ஆங்கிலத்திலே வர இருக்கின்றது. தொடர்ச்சியாக நீங்கள் இந்த நிகழ்ச்சியினை காணலாம். Welcome to IBC Tamil. This is the special interview today we have. This interview is about report which is produced by International Truth and Justice Project. The report is about Gotabaya Rajapaksa's role in 1989 mass atrocities. So we have two guests today who work closely with this report and who are the long-time experts and the researchers. Of course, they are kind of activists as well. So first of all, I'm introducing Bhashna Abeyawatana, a well-known journalist. He's a member of the JDS and expert as well. Welcome Bhashna to this interview.
Thanks for having me.
The next one is Ingrid. She's a co-author, a researcher, expert on the period. Particularly, she worked on Asia. I can say that she worked in the Nepal, Sri Lanka, and all of the places. So I welcome her to this show. This is kind of the interview I think she's facing first time in the IBC Tamil. Both of you are warm welcome to this show.
Pleasure to be.
Okay. I'm going to start with Ingrid straight away. Why? Because Tamil community or the Tamil people, or we can see in Sri Lankan people, seen this kind of reports after 2009. So many reports they have been seen. But why this report is very important and what is the content actually?
Good question. I think this report is substantially different from, as you say, the many reports, sadly, that over the years have been produced by organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Home for Human Rights in Sri Lanka, JDS, and so on. Those reports were mostly documenting what happened, looking at the violations, describing the torture, describing the killings, describing the disappearances. This report to some extent does that, but the focus is very much on the alleged perpetrators. That, the angle is to look at it from who is responsible here. We'd never really had so many reports in the past naming the officers in charge of Jaffna or Basikoloa when awful massacres like Okodicholai or whatever happened. So in that sense, of course, it's substantially different. Not to mention the fact that the person that is the focus, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is currently the president of the country, which, those days, the focus of the report is on the period 1987 to 1990 during the JVP insurrection in the south, when he was the commander of the district, in charge of the district in Matale, particularly in the period from mid-1989 to the beginning of 1990. Mm-hmm. So we really focused ourselves on that period and looked at the number of complaints that were made to the various commissions of inquiry that were set up by a later government, in fact, by the government of President Chandrika Kumaratunga, and analyzed, in which cases he was directly involved. We managed to find that nearly 700 cases happened in that period he was in charge, out of a total of just over 1,000 that were reported from the district for the whole of the period of 3+ years. The numbers in some of the months per month, there's like October 1989, there were 188, if I remember correctly, cases. So we was really seeing like a peak, which of course implies that there was a plan, that there was a clear strategy to disappear people. And indeed, the commission, the Central Zone Commission, I don't know whether I need to explain to your to your viewers that the commissions of inquiry that were set up were regional. So there was a Central Zone Commission which looked at the provinces in the center of the country, and that commission named Gotabaya as one of the persons against whom they thought there was evidence transpired they were responsible. So he was number 16. It relates to a case of someone who was tortured for 40 days, 40 days at the Vijaya College camp. This is people came forward to this commission, gave evidence against him. It's hard to imagine that, when the end of the war in the North and East happened, people would have dared to speak out. But at the time, he was a lieutenant colonel. He wasn't a big fish. So still, people felt they could name him. So I think it's really important historically, but also across, looking at the ethnic question in the country for people to understand, especially younger generations, and maybe never even heard of the fact that there was also so many disappearances in the southern part of the country.
Yeah, according to the report and according what you're saying, this disappearances has happened in South very much earlier. This is the question that how the people in the South who was suffered at the time react for this report after, kind of long period, isn't it? This is happening in the 1989, now we are in the 2022. And there was a commission that they released the report, but nothing has been taken up since then. So how is relevant to the international community, to bring up in the international community now, and how the people in the South react for this kind of reports?
Maybe Bashana knows more than I do about how people have reacted. I don't have access. I don't speak Sinhala. I don't read Sinhala. So
that's right.
He will be able to tell you more about that side of things. In terms of the international community, you know that there is still an ongoing process in the United Nations that Sri Lanka is yet again due to come before the Human Rights Council in September. That unfortunately, despite, in fact, the government in 2015, which included the current Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, accepted to deliver accountability for all the violations that had happened, especially in the North and East during the ethnic conflict there. And so far, Sri Lanka has not delivered on that at all. So this report, in a way, also, as I said earlier, it's bringing the wider picture. The lack of, Sri Lanka the government keeps saying that it will deliver accountability, that it has its own mechanisms, Office of Missing Persons, etc. But, time and time again, we have seen that the national level initiatives like commissions of inquiry are not delivering justice at all. And time has come to look at international options, universal jurisdiction cases, which is, criminal prosecutions in other countries for crimes committed in Sri Lanka. That for the violations described in this report, for instance, would qualify for that. The report makes that case. So that is really important, in my view.
All right, I'll go to the Bashna. Bashna, I'm starting with the same question. How do you see this report and why is it important in your point of view?
Well, personally, thank you for having me. And personally, I think there's personal reason as well for me, because I belong to this generation who were massacred in the South, actually. I spent my teenage time, during this period, and I lost quite a lot of friends and people I knew as a result of this government massacres. And in that sense, it is quite personally important for me. But apart from that, I think this report highlights the fact that criminality of the state is actually a long-running question. So this report highlights two important factors. One is the criminality of the state, and then the long-running policy of impunity. And so this has been, for decades and decades, this has been a constant policy of the Sri Lankan state, first to commit crimes and then to reward the perpetrators with impunity. And this report brings out, and it also creates a kind of like a dilemma to the Sinhalese, the majority community in the south, in the island, that they have to confront, they have to face with the reality that they want to actually forget and bury. And these are people they knew. So these are crimes that they knew that was happening around them. So this is not, because this actually poses an important challenge to the blanket denial they are having on the matter concerning state's criminality when the Tamils are raising the issue. So they keep saying the state did not commit any crimes against the Tamils, but this report highlights the fact, okay, let's leave aside the issue of the Tamils, not because that it is not important, but look, this is what happened among you, among yourselves, inside your society, and all these horror stories you have conveniently ignored, conveniently forgotten. And basically bringing it out is an important act, I think, as a Sinhalese, because it forces Sinhalese to think back and to deal with the questions that they have consciously, deliberately forgotten. So because of that, I think, because of these two reasons, I think the question of the report becomes quite an important thing, because this has been not only forgotten, but actually this information contained in this report has been officially buried until 2030. And that's one of the reasons that we couldn't get it out all these years. And fortunately, we managed to get hold of most of the evidence, and that makes it possible for us to bring the report out. So in that sense, the delay was actually for two reasons. One is because there was an official secrecy ban, and the second thing is actually, as I said, because in order to deny the crimes that were committed against the Tamils, we had to hide these crimes. Even though it was committed against our own people, we had to hide it because we thought it will be beneficial to Tamils if we come out with this information that the state is criminal, that can be a kind of a benefit for the Tamils. So that's in those two, there's a political thing as well as from a human rights point of view, it's quite an important report, I think.
Yeah, the question is how the people in South react to this report. As you said, it was buried, and at this time when the report comes out and your report comes out, how the people in South, I'm not just talking ordinary people, you work with lots of layers of the community, journalists, media people, media persons, activists, human rights activists, all those people, how they take this and how they're going to, because they are the one to take it to this report or this truth to the people, isn't it, to the South. Then how this happening and how they see this report?
Well, I think, there's a practical question, because actually for unavoidable reasons and also for certain kind of, because we didn't want to put out the Sinhala report along with the Tamil and the English report, because we thought it has a standalone kind of importance, because it has to be pushed into the society with a different separate publicity campaign, with a campaign to make draw people's attention to the report. Because if the three reports just be published at the same time, it will just get buried actually. Like what happens to most of the reports actually. Yeah. So we thought it's important, and also to make the physical report available, not online, but physical report available is quite crucial, because people don't have access to everyone, especially if you look at the population who are victimized in that region, and they are coming from very less privileged rural backgrounds. So even though the people who are directly related to the victims are almost, I would say, have died out now, the parents of the people who disappeared. But still, if the report can be made available physically, that will have an effect on it. And the thing is, actually, there's a bad thing about the timing, because the timing in the sense because of the crisis that is happening inside Sri Lanka at the moment. And the newspapers are not being regularly published. And the mainstream media, for obvious reasons, they would not carry it. And even the media that is willing to carry it, basically probably serialize even, they are finding it difficult to regularly publish their newspapers. So there are these kind of practical obstacles. But within the next 1 week's time, we are going to put it out in Sinhala, because it's already translated into Sinhala, but we are actually formulating a kind of a proper strategy to make it more available to the ordinary people who may have some time to look at it, to see, okay, this is about the people that we lost in this small area. So that kind of a thing would have an effect on them. So I think I can answer that question in a more kind of proper manner in 1 week's time. I will be in a position to answer that question in a more in a realistic way.
All right. Do you think, because you mentioned about the situation at the moment in Sri Lanka, the crisis that they had in Sri Lanka, but in another way, he was the Gotabaya when he elected as a president, or the Rajapaksa family, one of the most powerful family or the people in Sri Lanka at the time, that's gone another way now. So do you think this is a good opportunity to get to the people with this report?
Yeah, I think, that's another thing about this report actually, because by publishing this report, what we are trying to basically say, as I said earlier, there are crimes. State is the biggest perpetrator in Sri Lanka's history. And we are talking about always like 1971, there's a youth uprising and we said 20,000 were killed. And then the war started and then thousands were killed in the north and east, the Tamil people. And then between 87 to 1990, there was a second youth uprising in the south where 40 to 60,000 people may have died and killed during that period as a result of the state counter-insurgency campaign. And then again, in the next 20 years, there was a whole lot of, within the next 20 years, we are talking about 70,000 to 146,000 Tamils who were killed. So this has been a constant pattern of the way the Sri Lankan state has been acting throughout the last 4 or 5 decades. And so this, in that sense, to bring out this, to make them to see the connection between the decades is actually not we are changing the government, but actually we are changing the perpetrators. So we get all the time, we elect a new set of perpetrators to carry out the massacres, but at the same time, when you consider the information contained in this report and also the incidents that happened during the final stages of the war, it's the same people actually. It's more or less the people who have been accused of committing grave human rights violations, grave crimes, were the same people. They were, middle-level, middle-ranking officers at the time when they were committing this. So Matale district stands like a microcosm to understand the criminal efficiency of these perpetrators actually. They were given like a small district, like 1,900 square kilometers with 350,000, a little bit over than 350,000 population for 8 months. And this is the balance sheet actually. And if that applies to the entire country, and they were given, power to carry it out in the next, 15 to 20 years, they were put in charge to carry out a massive war, which actually resulted in all kind of crimes against humanity, human rights, war crimes, and including genocidal crimes. So in that sense, this report actually is not simply bringing out the plight of the Sinhalese, but it brings out also the the connection between the acts, between these two periods, connection between the two periods, because it's the same people who have been doing this. And after 30 years, in 2019, the same person was elected to become the executive president, and the same people have become the command of army, the defense secretary, and all these people are the people who've been running this kind of in a small district, running all this massacres. So in that sense, it's quite an important, I think.
Okay, Ingrid, I'll come to the point that you left last time, the international community. But there was a question about the international community, like United Nations, Human Rights Commissions, all about it. Sometimes people lost the faith of them because they believe it works in a kind of a way to go to the power sector rather than help finding the justice for the ordinary people. There's voices like that in the Tamil community as well, particularly after 2009, almost we passed a decade. So Tamils also won't get anything through this. Do you see how this point raising up and the failure? Do you believe that there's some kind of failure in the justice system in the international community?
I think what we've seen more generally globally over the last few years is indeed the UN being powerless, pretty much. Sadly, again, especially currently with the Ukraine war, they really are, showing up for the weak actor that they are. Nevertheless, what is the alternative? There is a need for reform in the UN. The role of China, the role of Russia, but in the Security Council. But to some extent, you could also argue that are easy excuses for other governments not to do very much. The resolution on Sri Lanka was passed in 2015. We are now 7 years later, and sadly there is very little to show. There is now this new Sri Lanka Accountability Project, which was set up last year, and they are due to report to the Council in September, provide their preliminary findings. They have a mandate to collect and preserve evidence of war crimes. I know they're busy doing that. So they are actually at least safeguarding evidence so that when and if governments like, let's say, the United Kingdom is prepared to arrest Sri Lankan perpetrators who are visiting here, who are living here, then at least the UN will be able to provide that evidence to the police here and to the prosecutors here to increase the chances of, justice being done, basically. I would like to come back, if I may, to some earlier point, which, the commissions of inquiry did not produce the list of the perpetrators. The list is there. It's about 2,000 in total, I think, the names. Including army people, but also politicians. And some of these politicians are still in power, including the one that is, of course, the focus of this report. So, a lot of time has gone by, but nevertheless, I think there is still a very real possibility of at least some justice being done in respect of some individual cases and individual perpetrators.
Yeah, that is going to be my next question, because these reports, particularly most of the reports, I can say, does focus on the individual. As Bashana said, these crimes are committed by Sri Lankan state. It's kind of the structure that how they operate to oppress the people. When the report is coming to focus as an individual, the state is escaped from what it did. Do you think is it going to be a different way to approach it, or do you think is the correct way to focus on the individuals rather than focus on the Sri Lankan state?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
No, I think it's a very valid point you're making. The Sri Lankan state is ultimately responsible, but the Sri Lankan state at the same time is also very active in practicing this, as Bashana calls it, the impunity policy. Literally has everything in place to stop accountability, real accountability, from being delivered at the national level. So the international system, we've had panel of expert report, OISL, the OHEHR investigation Sri Lanka report. We now have the Sri Lanka Accountability Project. So there are initiatives at the state accountability level happening internationally, but this making individuals accountable is in a way complementary to that, but also is in fact, I would say, potentially a pretty effective tool, because when these powerful people fear that they may get arrested when they travel, at least they will think twice, and maybe at some point they will take a risk and have to pay for it. It helps with putting the pressure on increasing the chances of state accountability by threatening at least with individual accountability. Criminal, yeah.
The focus on the report about Gotabaya Rajapaksa, at the time he was an army official. At this moment he is the president of Sri Lanka. He was elected by the people. So in the reality, people see this question as well. People have doubted how much is possible that he can be punished in the international criminal court or the international justice system, because people haven't seen that much happen in all over the world in the past 2 decades, I can say. So is there any possibilities to bring him for the trials or anything like that? How that is possible?
The system to bring him or others to justice will be somewhat different from one country to another.
Yeah.
What the US is able to do may be different from UK, may be different from Germany, Spain, and so on. So, but I was involved in a universal jurisdiction case involving a Nepali army colonel. In fact, similar rank to Gotabaya at the time, in this country, in the UK. And, the police arrested him when he came to visit and put him in prison. It took quite a long time to collect all the evidence, but in the end he was tried. And unfortunately he got acquitted, because that's the justice system. It has to be acknowledged that the level of evidence required is very high to pinpoint individual criminal accountability beyond reasonable doubt, which is the standard that is applicable in criminal trials, and also of course where you have a jury system. So all the defense lawyers have to do is to put doubt in the mind of the jury members, and they then might acquit the perpetrator. But there have been successful cases in Germany of Syrians, for instance, and in Sweden, and it can happen. And also in addition to having criminal trials, you can also have civil action. So you could have damages being allocated by courts to the relatives of the disappeared, for instance, so that he would be held accountable to pay millions in damages, or his property in the US might be confiscated. There's also other sanctions like travel bans, no visas. There is more. Is the direction of travel is there? We can see this growing, this possibility. But it would be wrong for me to suggest that it's easy. For sure, it's tough.
Yeah, Bashna, I'll come to you. These crimes happened when the JVP uprising, when there was a JVP taking a control of the state at the time. At the moment, JVP part of the vote bank politics, electoral politics. How they see this report and what is their point of view? Do you have any touching with them, or you have any says from them?
That's an interesting question, I mean.
Yeah.
But before answering that question, actually, let me briefly comment on the previous question you asked from Ingrid about individual responsibility and the systemic or the structural character of these crimes.
Yeah.
I think by exposing or bringing evidence against individuals, it also brings out the fact that since it has been happening for all these years, and for example, if you take an example, now these commissions, the 3 commissions and the All Island Commission was appointed by under President Chandrika Bandaranaike. Now, when she appointed commissions to look into the disappearances happening in the south, at the same time, there were people disappearing in the north while she was president. In 1996 alone, according to, I think, Amnesty reports released those days, within that 1 year's time, more than 650 people disappeared in Jaffna Peninsula. And this was when this was happening while these commissions were looking into the disappearances in the south. And so the thing is, actually, the reason the impunity has been a long-standing policy is because there's a structural character to the crimes. That's why, regardless of who's ruling the country, there's always a policy that passes from one ruler to another ruler that to deal with these people. I mean, we have never seen any single, kind of perpetrator being properly been dealt with. We have never seen it.
Yeah.
And that's mainly because it's structural character. So by framing individuals and bringing evidence against individuals, we can also expose the structural character of the crimes, because it has been happening for 4 to 5 decades or even longer. So that's something I want to say. But let me come to the question that you asked, which is quite important, about the JAP's response. And the thing is, actually, all this information, now JAP has been part of the government since 2001. And first they joined the government in September 2001 to form a probational government. And then again they joined the government in April 2004 to become a coalition partner of Chandrika's United
UPFA government.
People's Freedom Alliance government. And
where they brought the Rajapaksa family into the candidate.
They were quite involved in, one of the main key players in the campaign to make Rajapaksa president in 2005. And so their role has a kind of, it's like a split kind of identity, because they are part of perpetrators, but at the same time they were victims as well. Because they, by letting the perpetrators go free and basically working along with them for all these years, they have also become part of the state itself. But at the same time, there's a history where they had become the victim who was standing at the receiving end. And all these people who died in that period, either they were members of the JP, or they were sympathizers of the JP, or they were suspected for being close to the JVP. If you leave aside the kind of other cases that involve sometimes the personal kind of background. So in that sense, JP has, they are politically responsible as well as morally responsible for not confronting the criminality of the state for all these years. And they have degenerated into something that is, unimaginable. If that, I don't know whether that's a correct word to use, because it's something more than that, I would say. Because they have been through the whole process, and they were killed. It's not like it's not like mass shooting, but they were selectively arrested, and they were tortured in the camps, and then they were killed, and their bodies were burned on the roads. And we are talking about at least 40 to 60,000 lives perished in a matter of 2 years or 3 years maximum. So completely forget about it, not to deal with that crimes, even when they were in a position to deal with those crimes, brings out actually the real character of the JVP. And they were the most enthusiastic supporter of the war effort against the Tamils after 1995-6 kind of period, especially the final war. So in that sense, JP is not actually guilty of not remembering these crimes. Actually, they are guilty of deliberately forgetting these crimes, and also not confronting the state in the manner they should have done. And it's not simply betraying. Supporting the war effort. For example, they had become the most important mobilizer, the crowd mobilizer, to support the armed forces.
That's right.
And they went from one army camp to another army camp to boost the morale of the soldiers when they were engaged in the final war. And these were the same army, the commanders and all these people who were involved in committing, horrendous crimes against their own members. 30 years, 20 years ago. But they didn't care actually. So in that sense, I think the reason the JP did not, I mean, even after the Matale mass grave was found, when they found the mass grave in Matale with more than 154 bodies, it was forgotten within a matter of 2 months or something like that. The JP didn't dealt with it, and they didn't want to, work with the family members of the victims and to build a strong campaign and to confront the state criminality. And the reason they didn't do that is because they also thought it would be beneficial to the Tamils. If they focus on the same perpetrators who have been in command in that region, who are also being accused of committing crimes against the Tamils, that would be beneficial for the Tamils. And that was the reason JP didn't take it up. It was not a mistake, it was a calculated policy. And they are guilty of that policy actually.
But they said they changed now. They have a new leader and they're going towards, particularly to the people in the minority numbers in Sri Lanka, which include Tamils and Muslims. Do you see any characterized changes with them?
Well, to be honest, if you want to know my honest opinion, I don't trust them. Okay. As long as they don't deal with these things in an open manner, in a kind of, because the thing is, when they go to, like the recent meeting that they held in Jaffna, for example, they were basically saying that we have done mistakes. And I'm not sure whether this is the word to use to identify the policy of the JP during the wartime, whether they were mistakes, whether they were something that they not did deliberately. Because they were quite calculated policies actually to make sure, according to the current leader of the JVP, he admitted a couple of years ago, he admitted openly in one of the interviews, he said, we forced the government to use heavy weapons in April 2009. And the government, because of certain pressures coming from different international players, they were reluctant, or they were not, they were hesitant to use heavy weapons, and we basically forced them to use it. And then he said, we, in our self-critically, we see it as a kind of wrong thing to do. Is it that simple? I am asking that, Is it that simple? Asking more than 360,000 people cornered into 10 to 20 square kilometers area and bombing them, using heavy weapons against those people, even when the government is actually showing some kind of reluctance because of various kind of pressures. And if a movement says that we actually forced them to do that, and according to the previous, the former JP leader, late Soman Samarasinghe, he openly said at the end of the war, he said, it was we who actually convinced the government that we can win this war. And he said the way, he used a Sinhala term, saying that the way we took the government to war was like taking a dog to have a bath. He was reluctant, but we dragged him to the war. And this is what the JP said. And then going to Jaffna and telling Tamil people there had been certain mistakes, certain kind of things that we should have done, but we didn't do. I think it's very trivializing monumental crimes that they were complicit of actually.
All right. The question is, at the moment, you've been seen through the international community, in Tamil community, particularly after this 2009, and how do you feel the engagement for to get the justice for what happened in Sri Lanka to Tamils? So do you think they have to do something more, or do you think that they have to go in a different ways, or how do you see that they need to work to do more? Because we have minors and negatives, people talking about this is not right, we have to go in different ways, we are not enough to work inside the international community. So there's so many things is there. Well, I'm putting this question in front of both of you, and just share your views, how you see in the last 10 years the works that Tamils, ordinary people, activists, journalists, or the legal side, political side, how have done their work, and how should they do further? I can start with Inkri.
Well, the current crisis must teach us and people in Sri Lanka, including your people on the street, but also those in power, that business as usual is no longer an option. there is a need for a serious transformation and that need to include accountability for human rights violations, but accountability for many other issues as well, including corruption, abuse of power, and so on. Really, we need to have Sri Lanka needs to have a new broom, a new way of organizing the state, and one would hope that accountability for human rights violations would come into it with the IMF visiting the country, the World Bank involved, the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council. There are channels through which those conversations hopefully will happen, where one would hope the international community puts human rights and the issue of accountability center of their discussions with their counterparts, like Ranil Wickremesinghe, who I already mentioned earlier, did sign up to the resolution back in 2015. So let's remind him, let's ask him how he's proposing to progress with the implementation. That is at least one way to go forward. I look forward to hearing what Bashana.
Yeah. I think, one of the things...
I've asked this as well. When Ingrid mentioned about the Ranil Wickremesinghe, at this time, the JVP uprising, UNB was in the power, isn't it? It's how contradiction it is.
Absolutely. And there, in fact, was a commission looking at Batalanda, a place where he was in charge, where also torture and killings and disappearances happened.
Yeah, Bashana.
Yeah. So, one thing is actually when we talk about, I'm a little bit skeptical about this word all the time. This international community, because it gives the impression that it's a homogeneous kind of entity that we can, because it is not like that actually. There's nothing called, in my opinion, international community, a neutral international community. Because most of these crimes, when the crimes were committed, most of these members of this so-called international community were well aware about these things. From the evidence that we have seen from now, for example, the evidence like WikiLeaks, we see this has been a kind of common knowledge in most of the diplomats who would have definitely briefed their kind of, departments or the ministries head in the respective countries, that these things are happening. In real time, they were being reported actually, but there were no actions were taken. And as once Sir John Holmes, in one of the interviews done with Channel 4, openly says, everybody knew what was happening. He says openly, point blank to the camera, and he says, everybody knew what was happening, but everybody wanted it to be over as soon as possible. And that has been, he says, then, there's a silence, and then he says, I know it sounds cynical, but that's how it was. But that is actually the case, actually. For example, all these things now we are talking about in 1989, the massacres happened in the South. And then in 1990, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's family was living in US at the time, and then he had a kind of 3 months vacation in US, and then he came back, and after the assassination of the defense minister, Ranjan Wijeratne, then he retired from the army, and then he went to live in US, and he's a US citizen. Until the moment that he got elected, he was a US citizen. And all these things, the list of perpetrators were being, submitted to the government. And we have to believe that none of these events were unknown to the members of this international committee, which basically allowed him to roam free, all these people who have been committing serious crimes. And when there's quite important evidence, in 2009, for example, 2008 to 2009, the final stages of the war, at least since September 2008, from the moment the UN agencies were basically sent out from the war zone until the 18th of May, everything that was happened was quite well known. Actually, it's not completely, the international community were not actually sitting in complete darkness. They knew what was going on, and there was a calculated reluctance or deliberate policy not to engage in those things until there was effort independently made by various actors, like bringing out war crime evidence and, campaigns, people taking to streets and all these things. And it forced the official bodies to take a position. So I think because, the importance, in my opinion, importance is to maintain an independent narrative of the crimes that happen. Independent from the UN and independent from all the kind of official bodies, a narrative of the victims to maintain it, because that is what that will determine how these actors would basically respond. I mean, if we basically give all the kind of, authority to them to deliver us justice, in my opinion, from my experience, I think it will never happen. It won't happen actually, because at the end of the day, it's real politics working, and geopolitics comes important when it comes to country like Sri Lanka. Geopolitics becomes quite an important factor in deciding the policy towards Sri Lanka's politics. So therefore, I think it has to be considered by the victim populations that this is how things work. Whatever the verbal, said and promised, when it comes to practical actions, it will always remain in the hands of the victims how they are going to deal with these actions to put pressure, imagining new ways to put pressure on the so-called members of the international community, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for your sharing your knowledge and views on the report. And we wish you for the best interest of your work towards the Tamil community and the humanitarian prospects. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you, Nadesan, for having us. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is the end of the interview. Thank you so much for the viewers to view this interview in English, particularly because normally we're having discussions and interview in Tamil, but this time we hold this interview full in English because of the guest that we have and the importance about this report. Thank you so much again. We will see you in another show. Stay tuned with the IBC Tamil. Thank you.